Bettcher discusses violence against trans women by starting with a case study. So on October 3rd, 2002, Gwen Araujo was beaten, killed, and buried 150 miles out of Newark, California. Gwen was a trans woman, and before her death, she was sexually harassed and forced to reveal her genitals to her murderers. The murder was surrounded by suggestions that Araujo had done something wrong. One of those charged with the murder, Jose Morel, was quoted as saying, "Sure, we were angry. Obviously, she led us on. No one knew she was a man." Jose's mother also was quoted as saying, "If you find out the beautiful woman you're with is really a man, it would make any man go crazy." The defense argued that the murderers should receive a less harsh penalty, manslaughter in this case, because of the trans panic defense. So the murder was done in the heat of passion upon discovery of Araujo's biological sex. The jury remained divided on the question of whether the three were guilty of first-degree or second-degree murder. It seems like they didn't buy the trans panic defense in this case. But this trans panic defense has been used successfully, as we've talked about before, elsewhere. Some jurors agreed that sexual provocation led to the killing. So this is a case of blaming the victim for the acts of sexual harassment and then murder and beating as well. So Bettcher wants to know what is going on here. How is it that we are in a case where trans people not only face surprising or alarming amounts of violence, but are then in turn blamed for the violence that is done or acted upon them? So here are just some terms to get clear. Bettcher uses transgender to signify those who do not appear to conform to traditional gender norms by presenting and living genders that were not assigned to them at birth, or by presenting and living genders in ways not readily intelligible in terms of more traditional conceptions. So I'll just note this does not include gender identity in this case. She's just talking about people who present in one way that does not match with the gender that was assigned at birth. Transsexual is a narrower case of transgender. It used to be used a lot more frequently in the trans community, but it has kind of lost its favor in favor of transgender as it's more inclusive. The major difference is that transsexuals are those who are transgender who have also engaged in some hormonal or surgical techniques to alter their body in a way that is, quote, at odds with the sex assigned at birth. So these are people who are taking different hormones, or people who have had bottom surgery or top surgery, or maybe facial feminization surgery or something of that sort. She thinks of transphobia as not necessarily just the fear of trans people, but simply any negative attitudes, hatred, loathing, or rage, or moral indignation that's harbored towards trans people on the basis of our enactments of gender. So murder due to transphobia is rampant. 80% of trans persons report that they have had a transphobic verbal abuse. 30 to 50% report some transphobic physical assault. And this affects trans people of color to a much higher degree than it does white trans people. The kinds of violence trans people experience is not exactly like homophobia. So it would be wrong, she argues, to think of the thing that's happening here in this case study as one of homophobia. Why? Well, such an account would only make sense if we actually thought of Gwen as actually a boy. Such an account would fail to explain the transphobic charge of wrongful sexual deception and constitute another transphobic denial of Araujo's own identity. So those are the two major points. It mislabels Gwen in this case as a man, and it does not account for the issue of sexual deception that's at play. So there's a persistent stereotype of trans people as deceivers. You should have watched Disclosure by now, and you will see that stereotype played over and over again in media and film and television. There's this idea that trans people really are the gender that is revealed by their genitalia. There's also an equation of deception with rape. These both play a significant part in blame shifting, which is used to justify violence against trans people. And that any account of the murder of trans people needs to take that into account. A lot of the violence that we see imposed upon trans people is due to their gender presentation and then what their perceived sex is. So there is commonly an appearance-reality contrast, the appearance of their gender presentation and the, quote, reality of their sex body. And it's important for us to understand that this is a verb. Bodies are sexed by the medical establishment, the legal institutions, etc. And so someone's body takes on a certain type of meaning that we ascribe to it. This we've talked about from looking at Austa's work and Bettcher's other work and so on. So a male to female person, a person who's originally assigned male at birth, but who presents and lives as a female and is now a female, this person who is taken to misalign gender presentation with sex body is regarded as really a boy, appearances notwithstanding. So the idea is if an MTF person has a penis, for example, this is what we'll see with the natural attitude, then regardless of how they present and how they live in the world, they're considered really a boy. So underneath this idea is the kind of sexism that's discussed in Marilyn Frye. So if you recall in that work, there's this idea that those with certain sex-coded bodies are to display and adorn themselves and act in a particular way that announces those sex-coded bodies in a way that's consistent or coherent with the dominant conceptions of what sex stands for or what it means. So on the natural attitude, this is the one that's probably most common in our society. It's the folk understanding. And it's expressed in some of the comments that some people gave in the early discussions that we had in this course. Genitalia determines one's sex, and it's considered an essential, immutable, unchangeable thing. Even if you change the genital construction that you have through genital reconstruction surgery, some might consider that reconstruction artificial and itself a deception. So whatever genitalia you were given at birth, for this view, that determines your sex forever. Genitalia then play the role of the concealed truth that a trans person is concealing. It conceals the true nature of a trans person as really a boy, quote unquote, or really a girl, quote unquote. So the revelation of sex underneath all the adornment that comes with gender is the goal of disrobing that is common in assaults on trans people prior to their violence and murder that is imposed upon them. Even if we think of other more fine-grained determinants of sex that are more common in biology or medical discourses, Bettcher wants to argue that the natural attitude is always present. Even if you think that sex has more to do with hormone balances, or more to do with chromosomes, or more to do with pick your biological classification scheme, the natural attitude always rears itself in our society. So trans people really have a double bind here. There are two options. You can either reveal your gender history, or you keep your gender history private. But as we'll see, these result in no good outcomes on average. So if we recall Frye's conception of what oppression is, that is being put in a bind where you have two options, and those, at least two options, or none of those options that you have are going to be good. So you can either reveal your gender history, but you risk your life being seen as fictitious. One's own identifications aren't taken seriously. One will be viewed in a highly condescending way. One might be subject then to violence and even murder. You can also keep it private. So you then have to live in constant fear of exposure, fear of extreme violence and death. You have to worry about there being a disclosure of oneself as a deceiver or a liar. Maybe someone shares your history without you knowing, maybe through forced genital exposure. Then consequently, you have to fear being subject of violence and murder, and then be held responsible for that murder because you kept it private. There is a makeup tutorial artist, Nikki Tutorials, on YouTube. I give you her YouTube channel on the supplemental reading for this, or supplemental material for this section. And you can see her coming out video. She was it's called Going Stealth, a stealth trans woman running a very wildly popular and profitable makeup tutorial YouTube channel. And then someone challenged, you'll see in her video if you watch it, that someone threatened to out her. And so she was in this category, and she recalls or she conveys that she lived in constant fear of exposure. There's constant threat of being disclosed as a deceiver or a liar. And she chose, in light of that, before that person leaked that information, to control her narrative and present her gender history. And even though many people are supportive, there have been a lot of people who consistently in the comments will call her an it, will use other kinds of transphobic slurs, who won't see her as who she is. Her identifications aren't taken seriously. And now that she's out publicly, one might subject her to violence or murder at some point in her life. Bettcher gives us a nice summary of this double bind on page 51. Overall, we can characterize some of the consequences of this bind as follows. Insofar as trans people are open to constructions as, quote, really an X, appearances notwithstanding, we will immediately find ourselves represented in ways that are contrary to our own identifications. This construction literally reinscribes the position that genitalia are the essential determinants of sex by identifying that essential status as the hidden reality or truth of sex. So through this kind of construction, we will invariably be represented as deceivers or pretenders. This has the effect of doubly delegitimating our own voices by constructing us as both fictitious and morally suspect. So not only are we really something else, so our lives are fictitious, but also morally suspect because we're deceiving. Hence, after identity enforcement, nothing we might say could possibly matter. A framework has been deployed whereby transphobic violence may be excused or justified on the grounds that deception had been involved. The only latitude appears to involve the degree to which our pretense is viewed as harmless make-believe or evil deception. So the idea is that, according to dominant conceptions of gender, trans people are at best participating in some kind of make-believe, and at worst, engaging in some kind of evil deception that is deserving of punishment. There are some added complexities here. One's deceptions might be taken seriously, but one's own life might not be regarded that way. So exposure does not necessarily imply that people will take you for who you are. That's one of the problems behind revealing one's gender identity history. Even in cases where one is out as trans, one might not necessarily be exempt from accusations of at least the potential for deception, as we might see in bathroom discourses, the thinking of trans women as dangerous for other women, particularly cis women, in bathrooms. It's also not up to one whether one is outed. Even as Fry notes in her sexism article, it's very easy to be misgendered. It's also easy to be clocked. Clocking is the term that's used to be seen as the gender that you are assigned at birth, or seen in a way that you can think of it as clocked as homosexual as well, or clocked as trans or something like that. Whether that clocking is inaccurate or not. Passing is complicated, so the idea of passing as the gender that you identify as is a very complicated thing. It's complicated by racial norms that intersect with gender norms. As well, one's vulnerability to passing or getting clocked will depend on class and race intersections. So opportunities to pass are themselves often dependent on class, because who has access to gender-affirming surgeries or treatments, which are very expensive and not always covered by insurance? That will depend on how much money you have. Many MTF folks are vulnerable to sexualization on the pretender side of the bind, where the pretense is transformed into sexual fantasy. If you recall Rubin's account of sex hierarchy, which we covered earlier, trans folk are on the bottom of the sexuality rung, even though it's one of the only classifications on that list that refers only to one's gender identity and not to presentation. And this suggests, whether Rubin thought this or this was an anthropological description of the way that society thinks of trans people, this suggests that there's something intrinsically sexual about trans people. And as we've discussed with transmisogyny, this hypersexualization usually happens for trans women. So it would be wrong to think that all trans people are particularly singled out to display their sex on their sleeve. So this is a response that some trans activists, people that are in support of equal trans rights and so on, this is something that they advocate for or point out, that it's only trans people that are expected to convey what their sex is. But Bettcher disagrees with this. She says, no, that's not quite right. If we follow Fry and other analyses, all people in the sexism game are required to announce their sex. The specific problem for trans folks is that, according to dominant conceptions of gender and sex, they're playing that game wrong. So disclosure of one's sex doesn't preclude them from the calls of deceivers. We do not always control how others will interpret our meaning. So if I say, I am a trans woman, you might not hear, I am a trans woman, but rather, I am a man who lives as a woman. So this reminds us of Bettcher's first article about the multiple meanings that we assign to woman in different cultural contexts. So the transphobic deceiver pretender narrative flows from a fundamental communicative relation that obtains between presentation and body, a relation within which even non-trans people are implicated. So the transphobic deceiver pretender narrative comes directly out of the way that sexism functions in our society. The idea that some bodies, sexed in some way, have to present and announce that sex according to culturally relevant signifiers for announcing that sex. And if you don't do that game according to the dominant narrative, then you are subject to policing in the form of violence, in the form of sexual assault, and in the form of death and murder. Trans claims to authenticity are then a direct challenge to these constructions, and do so by disassociating gender performance from a particular gender disclosure. The idea being here that trans people are not announcing their sexed body parts by the gender that they perform. They're not engaging in the sexism gender game in the way that the dominant conception of gender and sex functions. So how does all this relate to rape and sexual seduction and race? So trans people are commonly sexually assaulted as a punishment for being, quote, exposed as deceivers. And perversely, the, quote, sexual deception itself is identified as a kind of rape of those who in turn raped that person and killed them. Janice Raymond, for example, identifies transsexuals as, quote, raping women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. Bettcher takes this language to be related to this representational relation between gender presentation and sex body. So again, this is a lot of words to say. When we say representational relation between gender presentation and sex body, we mean gender presentation is supposed to represent sexed bodies according to the dominant structure of sex and gender in our society. Again, we use sexed here as a verb because bodies are not sexed prior to someone assigning sex to it, prior to society attributing meaning to different body parts. Sexing is an activity, it's an action, it's an act of certification, an act of labeling. This is not to say, as we've talked before, This is not to say that certain biological parts of your body have biological significance, say for reproduction or for pleasure, but the grouping of these different categories as sexed in one way or another, that is the conceptual movement that's happening here. A heterosexual framework that centers upon the model of penis-vagina penetration informs the genital division of male and female. So one reason why we play this sexism game, the representational relation game, one reason for non-verbally communicating genital status is to secure hetero engagement. So a man needs to know a person has a vagina for the same reason a man needs to know about sexual willingness without actually having to ask. The idea that trans people, or trans women in particular, are predators in praise attire is predicated on the identification of the penis with the rapist and the assumption that female attire communicates absence of penis. So the idea here is that trans women, by presenting themselves as women, are deceiving other women, say in the bathroom or something, deceiving them by saying or communicating with their clothing, "I don't have a penis." And in this way, this deception is a kind of, according to Janice Raymond, a kind of rape. Rape can actually also be a method that's used to put trans men, who are taken as, quote, really women, to put them in their place. So once it's discovered that trans men don't have a penis, then the right thing for them to do, according to the dominant conception of gender and sex, is to punish them or push them back into presenting as a woman. And what's one way to do that? Well, to rape them. Transphobia, Bettcher argues, is fundamentally a part of heterosexual systems of violence and rape mythology. It is also deeply embedded in racial oppressions, sexual violence, and racist rape mythology. All of these gender presentations are understood in terms of not just sexed bodies, but also racialized bodies, genitalia, sexualities, sexual intentions. White female gender presentations have a special place in these dominant standards of female attractiveness. I mean, it's no surprise that those who are most vulnerable to this kind of transphobic violence are those who are women of color. And all of this is to say that gendered representation of genitals is fundamentally intertwined with a larger violent system of communication related to sex and gender representation. Some people might think that the correct solution to these issues is to just get rid of the trans panic defense. But Bettcher is skeptical. Legal solutions won't particularly help us here. Banishing the trans panic defense doesn't address the underlying systems of sexual and racial violence that contribute to transphobic violence. It is rooted in the communicative relations between attire and presentation and sex bodies that are thick in our society. Until the disruption of that happens, until gender presentation no longer correlates or is taken to correlate or required to correlate with genitalia or someone's sex assigned at birth, trans folks will be subject to violence by those who seek to police the adherence to this system. And this is why you'll hear some people say, let's abolish gender. Or this is why people will be so resistant to the idea that you can't wear particular clothes or something like that. On the trans perspective, or on the trans approach here, the idea is that gender should not be connected at all to one's sex assigned at birth, to particular genitalia. And Bettcher talks about this when she talks about the way that trans communities ascribe gender. Genitalia has nothing to do with it. And that offers all of us a different conception of what gender might be. Trans communities seem to get along fine without ascribing genitalia underneath gender presentation. If trans people and trans communities can do it, it's not clear why society at large can't.